She has preached to billions. Her voice has reached more corners of the earth than almost any other living minister. She has written over 130 books, built a global humanitarian empire, and stood on stages in front of hundreds of thousands of people telling them that God can heal what's broken inside them. But here is the question that her critics, her followers, and even she herself has had to sit with. What happens when the woman telling the world how to heal hasn't fully faced the truth about her own story? Joyce Meyer is one of the most recognizable names in Christian television, but the life behind that name is not the polished, triumphant tale that gets summarized in church bulletins. It is a story soaked in real darkness, shaped by real betrayal, and complicated by real failures. And now, decades into her ministry, some of the most uncomfortable truths about what she taught, how she lived, and what happened inside her own organization are finally being examined in full. This is not a story about tearing someone down. This is the story of a human being who built something extraordinary on a foundation of extraordinary pain, and what that costs when the world is watching. Pauline Joyce Hutcherson was born on June 4, 1943, in St. Louis, Missouri. The name Joyce Meyer is so well known today that it's easy to forget there was a little girl behind it, a child who entered the world during wartime, whose father had been enlisted in the Army, and whose earliest years were defined by instability and absence. When her father came home from the war, he did not come back as the man who had left. He came back changed, hardened, and dangerous. Alcoholism and manipulation became the twin pillars of his presence in the home, and the atmosphere he created was one of constant fear. Joyce became a Christian at 9 years old, but faith at that age, surrounded by that level of chaos, was more of a concept than a comfort. She needed someone to protect her. No one did. Her father began abusing her when she was a small child, and that abuse continued for more than a decade, well over 200 times, stretching across the years from her earliest memories until she finally left home at 18. The abuse was not only physical. He manipulated her sense of reality, told her that what was happening was normal, made her believe that she could not tell anyone, and conditioned her to survive through silence. At school, she wore a mask. She looked like any other student, but inside she was carrying something so heavy that it separated her from every person around her. And her mother knew. That is the detail that never fully loses its weight. Her mother saw the signs, understood what was happening, and chose to stay silent. For a child already being violated by the person who was supposed to be her protector, the silence of the second parent is its own kind of devastation. It is not just abandonment, it is confirmation that your pain does not matter, that you are not worth defending. Joyce has spoken about this betrayal throughout her ministry, and the fact that she returns to it again and again tells you everything about how deeply it marked her. She did not just lose her innocence in that house. She lost her belief that she could rely on anyone at all. By the time she was 18, her only ambition was escape. She did not dream of college or a career. She simply needed out, and so she married the first man who offered her a way. He was a part-time car salesman, charming enough on the surface, but the life he offered turned out to be another version of the instability she had just fled. He was a liar, a womanizer, and eventually a criminal. He disappeared for days at a time, leaving her without money or transportation. During a trip to Albuquerque, he abandoned her entirely, leaving her stranded with no way home. When she became pregnant with their son David, he moved in with another woman. 5 years she spent inside this marriage before she finally found the strength to leave. One of the most serious moments of that period was the crime she became entangled in through her husband's influence. He convinced her to steal payroll checks from her employer, which he then cashed for personal expenses. Joyce was young, emotionally shattered, and operating from a place of learned helplessness. She knew it was wrong. She did it anyway. Years later, she repaid every dollar. Her husband's path grew darker, and he was eventually caught writing fraudulent checks and sent to prison. His arrest finally forced the clarity that the marriage had never been survivable. Free from her husband, Joyce spiraled. She became a heavy smoker, spent time in bars, and moved through short-lived relationships that were really just attempts to fill the void that years of abuse had hollowed out of her. She was not rebelling. She was trying to survive her own interior. She had never been in an environment where healing was even a possibility. Then in 1966, she met Dave Meyer, an engineering draftsman and Army veteran, and from the first, he was different from anyone she had known. He was steady, patient, and possessed a kind of internal equilibrium that Joyce, carrying all of that unprocessed damage, initially found infuriating. She entered that marriage loaded with anger, with control issues, with a volatility that she herself has described in stark terms. She was verbally aggressive, domineering, and gave Dave the silent treatment for weeks at a stretch. Dave refused to be pulled into her storm. One day he told her plainly that he had tried everything to make her happy, that it was clear she had decided to be unhappy, and that he was going to enjoy his life regardless. That statement enraged her, and then it began to crack something open. Watching a person refuse to be pulled into your misery is one of the most confrontational experiences available in a close relationship. It forces you to own what you're carrying. At one point, Dave told her he was not sure how much longer he could sustain what their marriage had become. That was the wake-up call. She began slowly and painfully to allow the possibility that God could transform something as damaged as what she was carrying. In February of 1976, Joyce was driving home from a routine appointment when everything shifted. She had been living with a gnawing frustration, a gap between the life the Bible described and the life she was actually experiencing. That afternoon, she broke down and cried out to God, demanding to know why she wasn't seeing the victory His Word promised. She later described what followed as a sensation of being flooded with something like liquid love, a presence so overwhelming that she knew her life had just been redirected. She understood in that moment that God intended to use her story, specifically the painful parts of it, to reach other people. She started small, Bible study groups with coworkers, informal gatherings in restaurants and living rooms. In 1980, she became part of Life Christian Center in Fenton, Missouri, a congregation of about 30 people. She began leading a women's Bible study from her home, and within weeks, over 100 people were showing up. Within months, the number climbed to 500. The church's pastor, Rick Shelton, made her an associate pastor and gave her room to develop. She began recording messages for local radio from her son's bedroom closet, serving as a makeshift recording booth. It was modest, but it was the beginning. By 1985, she had launched her own radio program, Life in the Word. 5 years later, it had expanded to 6 stations across the Midwest. Her directness, her willingness to talk about real pain rather than sanitized spiritual theory, connected with people who were tired of being told everything was fine when their lives clearly were not. In 1993, Dave suggested taking the program to television. The show aired on WGN-TV in Chicago and then on Black Entertainment Television. In 1998, she renamed it Enjoying Everyday Life, and by that point it was broadcasting on hundreds of stations around the world. Today, Enjoying Everyday Life reaches an estimated 4.5 billion people across more than 100 countries and is translated into 113 languages. Her written work spans over 130 books. In 1995, she published Battlefield of the Mind, which became her most widely read work and remains a foundational text in Christian self-help literature. It gave millions of readers a framework for understanding why their faith did not seem to be producing the peace they expected. She is a #1 New York Times bestseller who has sold over 20 million copies worldwide. Her humanitarian work through Hand of Hope has treated over 3.9 million patients in 40 countries, distributed hundreds of thousands of meals in drought-stricken regions, provided emergency relief following natural disasters, and created the St. Louis Dream Center, which serves 70,000 meals monthly to people fighting homelessness, addiction, and poverty. But the success has always existed alongside serious and legitimate controversy. In 2003, an investigation by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch revealed that the ministry had purchased a $2 million personal residence for Joyce, along with 4 additional homes for her children, totaling another $2 million, all reportedly funded through ministry resources. The ministry's headquarters had reportedly spent $5.7 million on furniture and artwork, including a $30,000 malachite round table, a $23,000 antique commode with a marble top, and a $10 million Gulfstream private jet. Her personal salary at one point was reported at $900,000 annually. In 2007, the U.S. Senate Finance Committee launched an investigation into 6 major televangelists, and Joyce Meyer was among them. Senator Chuck Grassley sought financial records to determine whether these ministries were violating the terms of their tax-exempt status. Joyce eventually reduced her salary and announced she would rely on book royalties instead. In 2009, Joyce Meyer Ministries joined the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability and added non-family members to its board, though critics argued these were incremental adjustments rather than genuine structural reform. The scrutiny had exposed how thin the line was between ministry resources and personal wealth. when an organization is so thoroughly controlled by a single family. Dave as vice president, Daniel as CEO of U.S. operations, David leading Hand of Hope, Laura and Sandra in key roles. The family integration was total. The theological controversies run deeper than the financial ones. For years, Meyer taught that sickness or personal tragedy was the result of insufficient faith, that if your child died, the explanation was that you hadn't believed enough. This kind of teaching places devastating weight on people who are already suffering. It transforms grief into guilt and crisis into spiritual failure. In 2019, she posted a video on Instagram acknowledging that the teaching had been wrong and that she had placed too much responsibility on human faith for outcomes beyond human control. Some found this admission meaningful. Others felt it was insufficient accounting for decades of harm. She has also taught that Jesus temporarily ceased to be the Son of God during the crucifixion, and that believers are, in a meaningful sense, little gods sharing divine attributes. These claims put her in direct conflict with core historic Christian doctrine, and organizations like the Christian Research Institute have publicly described her theology as a false gospel. The most devastating single event connected to her organization was not of her making, but it happened inside it. On May 5, 2009, Christopher Coleman, the head of security for Joyce Meyer Ministries, murdered his wife Sherry and their two sons, Garrett and Gavin, inside their home in Columbia, Illinois. Coleman had been conducting an affair and had been manufacturing false death threats against his family for months, claiming his work with the ministry had made them a target. The investigation revealed the affair, the emails, the lies. In 2011, he was sentenced to life in prison. Sherry's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Joyce Meyer Ministries, arguing the organization had known about the affair and threats and failed to act. The ministry denied responsibility. In 2013, a judge dismissed the case, finding no legal basis to hold them accountable. The questions it raised about what was known and when have never been fully answered. Most recently, in January of 2025, Joyce Meyer paused her long-running program on Daystar Television Network, where it had aired for nearly 20 years. The decision followed allegations that Daystar co-founder Joni Lamb had covered up sexual abuse of a young child within the family, along with additional claims of financial misconduct and spiritual abuse. For Joyce Meyer, who has built a significant portion of her public identity around her own survival of childhood sexual abuse, remaining on the network was not a position she was willing to hold. She left. Other prominent voices in Christian media followed. Joyce Meyer is 81 years old. She has lived through things that would have permanently destroyed most people. The financial excess is real. The theological overreach is real. The humanitarian impact is real. The courage it takes to stand in front of millions of people and say that what you preached for years was wrong is also real. She is not a saint. She is also not simply a fraud. She is a person who was broken in her earliest years and who made something complicated and enormous out of the pieces. What you make of that depends entirely on which part of the story you decide to look at directly. The whole story, though, is the only version worth knowing.